On a single day in May 1901, one stock on Wall Street nearly destroyed the men who believed they understood it. Inside the New York Stock Exchange, the air felt heavy with expectation. For weeks, the market had been rising, and railroad shares climbed day after day, each new advance convincing more men that a great expansion of American industry had begun. Factories were growing, railroads were expanding across the continent, and banks were lending freely. The future, it seemed, belonged to progress. During that particular week, one stock had begun to dominate every conversation on the floor: Northern Pacific Railroad. The price had already moved far beyond what most traders considered reasonable, yet the buying did not slow. Orders continued to appear, and bids were lifted again and again, each one higher than the last. Men spoke about the stock with unusual certainty. Some called it progress, others called it opportunity, and a few called it inevitable. Behind the movement were powerful interests: James J. Hill, Edward Harriman, and the quiet influence of J.P. Morgan. Each of them wanted control of the same railroad. But on the trading floor, the men shouting orders did not see strategy or corporate battles. They saw something much simpler: a rising price. And a rising price always invites participation. Many traders believed the stock had already risen too far, so they began selling it short, convinced that reason would soon return to the market. After all, no stock could rise forever, or so they believed. My name is James R. Keene, and that morning, as I watched the floor of the exchange, I began to notice something most men had not yet understood. The market was no longer behaving like a market. It was beginning to behave like a trap. At first, the mood on the floor remained confident. Traders continued to sell Northern Pacific short with the calm certainty of men who believed they understood the situation. To them, the rise had become irrational, and irrational markets, they believed, always correct themselves. The logic seemed simple: a stock cannot rise forever. Eventually, profit-taking begins, buyers grow cautious, and prices fall back to levels that make sense. So the orders continued: sell Northern Pacific. More slips appeared in the hands of brokers. More shares were borrowed. More traders entered the same position, each of them convinced that the market had already reached its limit. But the market showed no interest in their logic. Every time the price rose, buyers were already waiting. The bids appeared almost instantly, as though someone expected the stock to be offered and was prepared to absorb it without hesitation. The movement of the price began to feel unusual. Not dramatic, not explosive, but steady, persistent, almost deliberate. The stock moved upward as though an invisible hand were guiding it. From where I stood above the floor, I began to watch the behavior of the brokers more carefully. Some of them were no longer shouting prices with the same confidence. They began asking quiet questions of one another. Who is buying, and where are the shares going? Those questions traveled through the room in whispers rather than shouts. When markets behave normally, shares move constantly between buyers and sellers. They circulate through the system, and a trader who needs stock can usually find it. But Northern Pacific was beginning to behave differently. The shares seemed to disappear. Brokers searched for stock and found less of it available than they expected. Orders to buy were filled quickly, while orders to sell became harder to match. The imbalance was subtle at first, but experienced traders began to feel it. By late morning, the whispers became more frequent. Men leaned closer to exchange quiet information. It appeared that large blocks of Northern Pacific stock had been quietly accumulated, bought, removed from circulation, and held by powerful interests who had no intention of selling. This changed the entire structure of the market. A short seller depends on one simple condition: the shares he sells must eventually be available for purchase when he decides to close his position. But if those shares are no longer available, the trade becomes something very different. The short seller loses control, and the market begins to control him. The price continued to climb: 120, 130, then higher. On the floor, the tone of the room began to shift. The confidence of the morning slowly faded, and traders who had entered their positions with calm certainty now watched the price more carefully. A few began covering their shorts early, buying back shares before the price moved even higher. But many others remained confident. They believed the rise could not continue much longer. They had seen similar situations before. Markets often exaggerate, and exaggerated markets eventually return to reason. But the behavior of Northern Pacific suggested something else. The buyers were relentless, the sellers were disappearing, and the men who had sold the stock short were becoming increasingly aware of a dangerous possibility. They might not be able to find the shares they needed. As midday approached, the price climbed again, 140, then 150. The movement of the stock was beginning to attract the attention of the entire exchange. Traders who had not previously been involved began watching the board. Messengers carried fresh orders across the floor, and the noise of the room grew louder. Excitement was spreading, but beneath that excitement another emotion was beginning to form: unease. Because the market was beginning to reveal something most men had not anticipated. The supply of Northern Pacific shares was far smaller than they believed, and if the supply was small, the consequences could be enormous. By early afternoon, the atmosphere on the floor of the exchange had changed completely. Traders who had entered their short positions calmly were now watching the board with far greater attention. Northern Pacific continued to rise. The price moved steadily upward, almost without interruption. Every attempt to sell the stock was met immediately by new buying. It was becoming clear that someone was determined to control the supply. Brokers moved quickly across the floor, carrying urgent messages. Clerks struggled to record the constant changes in price. Traders leaned over the railings, trying to hear the latest quotations through the growing noise. The room was becoming restless. The price reached 160, then 170. For the men who had sold the stock short, the situation was becoming uncomfortable. A short position can tolerate a small rise in price, but when the market continues moving higher, the pressure grows quickly. Some traders decided to close their positions early. They began buying shares to return what they had borrowed, and their buying pushed the price even higher. 180, 200. Now the entire exchange was watching Northern Pacific. What had begun as a confident trade was beginning to look dangerous. Every man on the floor understood the mathematics of the situation. If too many traders were short the same stock, and if the available shares had already been absorbed by powerful interests, then the price could rise far beyond what anyone expected. A few experienced operators began to withdraw quietly from the trade, but many others hesitated. They believed the rise must soon end. But the pause never came. The price moved again. 210, 220. News of the extraordinary rise in Northern Pacific spread across the financial district. Brokers rushed between offices carrying updates, while telegraph lines carried prices to other cities. Inside the exchange, the tension was building rapidly. More short sellers began to cover their positions, and each purchase added more fuel to the advance. The buyers who controlled the stock seemed perfectly content to allow the pressure to increase. They did not rush. They simply allowed the market to move against the men who had bet on its decline. By mid-afternoon, the price climbed even further, 250, then 300. The noise on the floor grew louder with every new quotation. Traders who had once spoken calmly were now shouting their orders with urgency. Some attempted to locate shares anywhere they could find them, but the supply remained scarce. The men who needed Northern Pacific most were the men who had sold it short. And now they were discovering a painful truth about markets. When too many traders take the same position, the market eventually finds a way to punish them. By late afternoon, the situation had turned into something few men on Wall Street had ever witnessed before. What had begun as an ordinary speculative trade was now transforming into open panic. Northern Pacific continued to rise, 350, then 400, then even higher. The numbers appeared on the board faster than many traders could process them. Each new quotation moved through the exchange like a shock. Short sellers were no longer thinking about profit. They were trying to escape. 450, 500. The market was no longer controlled by reason. It was controlled by pressure, and pressure when it builds inside a crowded trade, can push prices to levels no one believes possible. As the afternoon moved toward its close, the extraordinary rise of Northern Pacific continued. $700, then higher. Each new quotation traveled across the exchange like a wave of disbelief. At one moment late in the day, the price approached a level that stunned the entire market, near $1,000. For a railroad stock, the number sounded almost unreal. But the price was no longer about value. It was about pressure. Eventually, agreements were made and shares began to return to the market. Slowly, the panic eased. But the lesson of that day remained. Markets do not become dangerous when prices are low. They become dangerous when certainty spreads faster than caution. When too many men believe the same story, the market begins to prepare a different ending. My name is James R. Keene, and the events of May 1901 taught me something I would remember for the rest of my life. The crowd feels strongest when it moves together, but the market is most powerful when it moves against them.